was originally a member of the Red Hair Pirates, maybe even the original first mate up until Mihawk's.
I've been wanting to watch more Hidden Island stuff. I've been seeing him talk with Parvision, Randy Troy, and the rest of the guys. So I've been really enjoying the things he's been saying about like his theories and stuff. So I've been wanting to check him out. So I'm actually thinking about doing like theory days and picking a specific theory creator and just going through some of their best theories. So yeah, let me know if that sounds like something you guys like.
Ambition drove a wedge in their friendship and catalyzed a duel that would be felt the world over. My name's Hidden, and a year ago I made a video talking about this exact idea, and today, lovely internet people, I'm going to do it again. Welcome once again to the Hidden Island, and this is my final take on Dracula Mihawk.
Whoever you got to do this, 10 out of 10. 10 out of 10. This intro shit is fire. Fire.
Man, oh man. Who doesn't love a good rivalry? Goku and Vegeta, Naruto and Sasuke, Sakuragi and Rukawa, Musashi and Kojiro, Onision and Chris Hansen. The list goes on and on. Whether it's the classic optimistic protag and his best friend with an attitude, or two uncontested badasses who have finally met their match, rivalries are a core part of any shonen manga. They drive the plot forward, give characters motivation, and force the reader to pick a team. Competition is a really good way to make a plot interesting very quickly. It's the reason tournament arcs are a staple of the genre, and rivals create this competition in spades because oftentimes they're also paired with an emotional investment, which then vicariously transfers over to us, the reader. In other words, it's a tried and true formula for some primo shit. And so I want to take the opportunity today to theorize about and highlight one of the most important rivalries in One Piece, a tumultuous past that has very likely laid the foundation on which our number 1 and 2 Straw Hats currently stand, changing the trajectory of their lives forever. I'm talking about Red Hair Shanks and Hawkeye Mihawk. The question of the day is, what happened between these two? They used to be such good frenemies, such wasted potential for anime violence. At one point they famously dueled each other, but we've never been told the outcome. What led up to their duel in the first place, and why is Mihawk dodging the rematch so hard? Why is he a pirate without a ship, a crew, or a Jolly Roger? Why has he spent all these years sitting around reading newspapers, and why has Shanks spent the last 10 years...
When did this come out? 3 months ago. 3 months ago. Was that before or after we found out he was the Marine killer, pretty much? Because I'm loving where he's going with it so far, especially with him thinking that he was on Shanks's crew at first, which is a great like point. I think I've heard people mention something like that, but not really ever really going in detail over how it would have been possible. So I can't wait to finish his thought, for him to finish his thought on this. But with us finding out that he was considered the Marine killer or the Marine hunter, I would doubt that Shanks would allow that from a crewmate.
Bar hopping. What actually happened?
Allow that, and him still be chummy with the Marines and being able to walk into the girl, say if that man was allegedly him and not a twin. Okay.
happened between these two, and what are we missing? Well, apparently they used to be great rivals, but not anymore. Mihawk claims that Shanks' missing arm is the reason he's lost interest in dueling him. On the surface, this appears to imply that Shanks can't fight at his full strength anymore, and thus he's no longer a worthy rival. Today I'm going to explain why that's not the case, and why Shanks sacrificing his arm actually means something else entirely. Mihawk can see through this shit, guys. If he couldn't take his arm, no one else could. The rest of the world seems to fear him even more now that the arm is gone. See, it doesn't mean that he's become weaker and can't compete. No. I think it's the opposite. I think the giving of the arm means that he's found a greater rival than Mihawk. Not to speak to his strength, I just don't think Mihawk is after the One Piece. He, presumably, like Zoro, wanted to be the greatest swordsman. That mission's been accomplished for quite a while, and he hasn't gone looking. Shanks, however, presumably wants to find the One Piece. Mission not yet accomplished. So what if he discovered a new rival, someone who could match his fire and ambition as a pirate, one that reminded him of his former captain and would, in 10 years, grow to surpass him in a race for the greatest treasure in the world? But for this to make the most sense, we need to...
Looking for an easy way to get that LLC next to your business name? Say hello to Taylor Brand. You just go to the
timeline this. Let's rewind back to chapter 1. This is Shanks. Shanks is a very powerful pirate. At this point in the timeline, he's famous, but not an emperor yet. He has a straw hat and 2 arms, and he is rivals with Dracula Mihawk. This info is going to be important when we have to consider the relationship these two held at the time. We now know when in the timeline Shanks achieved his Yonko status, which was 6 years ago. Chapter 1 takes place 12 years before the present day, meaning 6 years before Shanks became an emperor. Film Red also gave us a canon bit of information where it's revealed that 12 years ago, the Shanks we see in chapter 1 at the time had a bounty of 1,040,000,000 berries. And we know that Mihawk stopped being Shanks' rival at this point in his career because it's just after this point that Shanks loses his arm. Why is all this important? Let me answer that question with another question. When did Mihawk become the world's greatest swordsman? Was it before this point? This info leads me to believe the answer is no. When he and Shanks were rivals, Mihawk had not yet become the strongest, and Shanks' bounty and reputation at the time is the biggest reason I believe this. Rivals tend to parallel each other in their growth. That's how they're written in fiction typically, or at least in One Piece. Roger and Whitebeard had comparable notoriety, so does Luffy and Kid and Law. They all have the same bounty right now in the story. And with these two, their duels gain notoriety within the pirate world, grabbing the attention of even Whitebeard, who spends half of his introduction talking shit about the younger generation. Even this guy was impressed. In other words, this was not Zoro at Baratier. This duel did not sound like a one-sided affair. They wouldn't be considered rivals if Mihawk was already the definitive strongest in the world and was whooping Shanks' ass or something. But if we are to assume that he's the best already by this point, then we also have to...
That is actually a great point. And also, he forgets to mention that, like, he only said that he's not a threat because even though he is proficient with both hands, he lost his dominant hand. So that's what the thing is too with sword fighting and competing on that type of a level. Yeah, you could still be proficient and probably compete nearly to your fullest potential with your other hand, but there's always going to be that difference when you lose the ability to use your dominant hand. Like it's just different.
To acknowledge that his opponent and his so-called rival was an up-and-comer with only a Yonko commander level bounty. And sure, bounties aren't the most accurate measure of strength or whatever, but if the world's strongest swordsman was being given
I do not use bounties as like a parallel to strength, only because like it's not only about that. It's influence and knowledge, like in how much of a threat you are to the world government. I feel like that's the main issue. Like Kaido had such a big bounty because he was strong, but also he wanted to cause war and chaos throughout everywhere. Like that, he's a huge threat to the population at hand. And that's another reason like why I say it has to be more. It's just be more than that, because it can't just be it can't just be like strength, because it just doesn't make sense.
By a pirate with a measly 1 billion berry bounty, then this story would have very different connotations. Dueling with the world's strongest before becoming an emperor and walking away from it alive? If anything, that would call the legitimacy of Mihawk's title into question. Are we truly suggesting this guy reached the top 2 decades ago and never progressed beyond that point? Never improved in the last 12 years? What would that say about Zoro? If this was the case, then Zoro should already be at the level necessary to challenge the title himself. What seems more likely is that at some point between the beginning of the story and the present day, after his rivalry with Shanks came to an end, after Shanks lost the arm, Mihawk earned the title of the world's strongest swordsman, much like how Shanks earned his own title as Emperor of the Sea. More specifically, I believe that when Shanks and Mihawk were rivals, they were competing with each other as swordsmen for the same title. However, this changed when Shanks lost his arm. So then the burning question is, why did a guy this powerful give up his sword arm, one of his most important assets? Well, I think this was his way of pulling himself out of the running, because from then on, Shanks pretty much disappeared into the shadows of the world. He didn't go after the One Piece, and he's been doing nothing really besides hanging around his territory, waiting all this time for Luffy to fulfill his promise and catch up to his crew's level. Only after which, he would then begin to search for the One Piece. I believe the day Shanks gave Luffy the Straw Hat, the day he gave him his arm, something Mihawk couldn't even claim from him, he put his dreams on hold. He stopped all his ambition as a pirate and began a sort of hibernation that would last until Luffy fulfilled his end of the bargain. And so for the next 12 years, Shanks wouldn't seek the One Piece and patiently awaited his new rival to meet him on the high seas and challenge him to the title of Pirate King. Maybe Mihawk recognized what this symbolized and thus stopped dueling with him, and Shanks conceded their rivalry because now he had his sights set somewhere else. I believe it was in this 12-year span, this gap in his career, that Tony Hawk became the best in the world. I'd be surprised if this was a title that was awarded to him by the world government once he became a warlord, or maybe even the inverse. He was offered a warlord position once he achieved the title, but I don't think he did this before 12 years ago. As we learned recently, there must have been a period of time when he wasn't known as the strongest swordsman, but instead known as Marine Hunter. He famously held an anti-marine epithet.
Okay, yeah, so this came out after that.
At some point did a 180 and allied with the Marines. I'd imagine they wouldn't continue calling him Marine Hunter if he was working as a warlord, kind of fostering a toxic work environment there. So what if around the same time his title was changed from Marine Hunter to just Hawkeyes or World's Strongest Swordsman? Something to think about. Here's another way to look at it. The youngest Mihawk we see is at Roger's execution, 19 years old. I think we can safely assume that in a world full of all these other insane swordsmen, Odin and a prime Rayleigh included, Mihawk was certainly not the best as a teenager. Shanks set out and formed his pirate crew only 2 years after this, at 17 years old, the same age as Luffy was. At this point, Mihawk would have been 21. Once again, it's possible that he already achieved the title at this young of an age, but there's so much S-tier competition out there still, left over from Roger's generation, that stacked the odds against him. This is also a whole 10 years before Shanks had a billion berry bounty. So this means the two of them had to have at least one close duel with each other over the years prior to even this happening, when Shanks didn't even have his first billion. Safe to say that these two guys fighting at a sub 1 billion elo.
The way he just broke down the timeline of how they could have met it was nuts. Very impressive and very believable. Like, yeah, they could have had a fight like right after Roger's execution, like, you know, weeks or months, you know what I mean, whatever. But still, like, that could have. It was an inspirational moment for a lot of people.
Probably not the best in the world. Once again, it was after Shanks lost the arm, after their rivalry ended, once they both matured and went their separate ways, that both Mihawk and Shanks acquired their respective titles, at least in my opinion. At the beginning of this video, I talked about how rivalries are great catalysts of change, but in this case, some of the biggest changes in the lives of these two characters happened after their rivalry ended. Why is that? Well, without competition, you have no one standing in the way way between you and the top. Shanks loses an arm and waits around for Luffy, pulling himself out of the running for strongest swordsman. Mihawk becomes a warlord of the sea, no longer a pirate, effectively pulling himself out of the race for the One Piece. Without any competition from each other, they both move to the top of their respective ladders. Shanks parties all day, Mihawk is bored all day, and they both wait around until someone else finally comes along worthy enough to challenge them. So I think their initial rivalry with each other was only the setup for something more important, the cultivation of the next generation, and their second rivalry with their future successors. Shanks directly competing with Luffy for the One Piece is the culmination of Luffy's entire journey so far, the ultimate answer to the setup given in chapter 1. It's Shanks' entire purpose, the entire reason he put his life on hold for 10 years, at least as far as we can tell. Luffy is the man Roger was waiting for, and Shanks would be the one to see him truly come into form. Likewise, Mihawk's eventual fight with Zoro is not only the peak of Zoro's adventure, but Mihawk's as well. His journey to the top was likely an
like 6 people in here. Thank you for showing up. Appreciate it.
Challenge became handicapped and took himself out of the game. Mihawk became the strongest without truly defeating everyone who stood in his way, and he sat at the top uncontested for years with no one left to light the fire of competition in his heart. No wonder the guy seems so bitter. Zoro is the answer to that boredom. Instead of defeating yet another wannabe swordsman, Mihawk saw the potential within him and transformed Zoro into the ultimate opponent. Put simply, Shanks and Mihawk were rivals before the story of One Piece began. After it began, this relationship ended. They both reached the top of their respective ladders and spent many years just sitting around killing time. Since Luffy and Zoro's adventures have started, they have each climbed those very same ladders and are now closing in on the top. Thus, Shanks' rival has shifted from Mihawk to Luffy, and Mihawk's rival has shifted from Shanks to Zoro. In surpassing Shanks and finding the One Piece, Luffy will have completed his character arc as established in Chapter 1, and by defeating Mihawk in a rematch for the title of World's Strongest Swordsman, Zoro will left eye. Both have heavy associations with the color red, and both was the Kaigun Gari, while Zoro was the Kaizoku Gari. Mihawk went from hunting marines to fighting alongside them, like how Zoro went from hunting pirates to makes him the same tier of
the parallels between them. I didn't need to hear that. I just need to know
pirate is Shanks, even if it's not entitled.
About the
already, there's a lot of comparing we can do between these two. So with all these connections, a fun idea.
Because he made a claim of
a little over a year ago, a theory about the true nature of Mihawk and Shanks' history and prior relationship. A theory that attempted to answer the question of why Mihawk seemed to lack a crew, a ship, and a Jolly Roger of his own. The answer, I believed, was simple. Mihawk was never the captain of his own crew, but instead was part of someone else's, that before he became a warlord, Dracula Mihawk was part of the Red Hair Pirates. This theory in my video faced some objections back then, so I'm going to use this opportunity with all this context established to re-explain why my opinion on this theory has not changed. It goes something like this. Once upon a time, Marine Hunter Mihawk became a part of the Red Hair Pirates. Although Shanks had his own goals, Mihawk had the ambition of becoming the world's greatest swordsman, much like Zoro does today. Mihawk and his captain did not agree on a lot of things, eventually creating a rift between himself and the Red Hair crew. Little by little, Mihawk becomes inclined to leave. Eventually, he becomes such a good swordsman that not many people stood in the way between him and the top. But Shanks, his captain, was also a swordsman, a sword main, if you will. And so Mihawk's very own captain was the only person left in the way of his goal. And when faced with the choice of either his own ambition or his captain's, in an opposite fashion to Zoro, he chose his own. Mihawk and Shanks have a famous duel, one tragically between captain and first mate, that is spoken of across the sea. We do not know who wins, but Mihawk leaves the Red Hair Pirates and now crewless takes up an invitation to join the Seven Warlords, guaranteeing his protection from the law as a lone pirate and giving him an excuse to fight all the other swordsmen out there as a warlord in the singular pursuit of his goal. And why not trust him? He just fought his own captain. Shanks meets Luffy, gives him the hat, and 10 years later, Luffy and Zoro run into Mihawk at Baratie, introducing us to his character for the very first time. With that established, these are the most common objections I've received in response to this idea. There's no way Mihawk would be subordinate to Shanks. He's older than him and was more famous than him back then. Shanks became famous by fighting Mihawk, not the other way around. This is one of the most common objections, and I'm not sure why. The first half doesn't really matter, and the second half is just flat out fanfiction. Zoro is older than Luffy. Ben Beckman is way older than Shanks. Rayleigh was even a year older than Roger. If anything, the precedent set supports the age gap here. There's no rule that says older pirates don't answer to younger pirates. Almost every single person on Luffy's crew is older than Luffy.
I was about to agree with that as well. Like, a lot of older people follow younger people in this.
What about fame? Well, Jinbei was famous for decades before he met Luffy. He was the captain of his very own crew at one point. And wasn't Zoro already famous before Luffy met him? He heard about Zoro in passing before they met. In fact, if it weren't for his fame as the pirate hunter, Luffy probably wouldn't have stumbled into him in the first place. I wouldn't be surprised if Mihawk's fame as the marine hunter had similar results. Mihawk doesn't trust people. He's a lone wolf. He doesn't need a crew. Well, first off, that's just not true, or at least incredibly unlikely. Mihawk has to have been part of or captain of a crew at some point. You're telling me this guy booked it across the Grand Line solo since he was a kid with no crew at all? That would probably make him the all-time greatest pirate. Not even Gold D. Roger or Whitebeard or Rocks or Luffy or any of the other greats could do that. None. A big lesson of the story is teamwork makes the dream work. The Grand Line is serious business, and until Mihawk became strong enough to become the best, there's no way he could do it completely alone. And sure, he's a lone wolf now. He doesn't trust people, but that's typically a position you take after learning from experience. If he doesn't trust people, we should be stopping to ask ourselves, why? Who broke his trust? Previous crewmates? Why else does Mihawk seem to be on such a friendly basis with Shanks despite their history? Why was Mihawk completely unfazed by having to fight Whitebeard and his entire fleet, but the moment Shanks arrived at Marineford, he refused to engage? A simple answer would be that he has deep-rooted history with this man. Perhaps he doesn't want to fight his old friend to the death. Some might say no, he was a captain himself. Well, if so, what happened to the rest? Who was his first mate or his doctor, and so on? Why haven't we seen those characters? Wouldn't it make more sense to make him a part of an existing crew of people we already know, instead of suddenly establishing brand new crewmates without any mention of them anywhere prior in the story? Would explain his lack of a Jolly Roger, would explain his lack of a ship and crewmates too, because they never existed. Maybe the simpler answer is better here. Ben Beckman is already Shanks's first mate. That's fair. The interesting thing is, though, Luffy and Zoro met first, and Roger and Rayleigh met first. Those two pairings formed the starting core members of their respective crews. But although Beckman is the first mate, Shanks's first crewmate didn't seem to be Beckman. It was Yasopp. But Yasopp isn't the number 2 of their group, so this first mate position was not as clearly locked in with Shanks as it was with Luffy and Roger. We never actually see the moment these two met. Does this imply that Beckman came around later? We see most of Shanks's current crew in chapter 1, but there's a 10-year gap between when we meet his...
I didn't know Yasopp was his first crewmate. Maybe I did, but it's pretty cool information.
They were first formed. A lot can happen in 10 years. That's a lot of time for a crewmate to potentially leave and for the crew dynamics to change. But we'll talk more about Beckman in a bit. Anyway, you guys get the picture. There's a ton of reasons I believe this is what happened, not including all the similarities and parallels and the rivalry stuff that I lived.
If you work in IT, you need Terra, an all-in-one remote monitoring and management solution to run your
listed out before. Believe it or not, there's a lot more, so let's work from the outside in. Mihawk, like I said before, has some heavy visual carryovers from the villain of monsters, Cyrano. Cyrano used a horn to call upon the power of a giant red dragon for his dirty work, which Ryuma would later kill. If we can trace his inspirations to Mihawk, and if Mihawk were at one point the right hand to Shanks, then what a coincidence that the figurehead of their ship is a red dragon. This would have a double meaning if the Figarland family mentioned in Film Red are celestial dragons, meaning Mihawk's former captain was a red-haired celestial dragon. Another thing to point to, since we're talking about his ship, is its inspiration. Shanks is now officially confirmed to have deep ties with Elbaf, meaning that the Red Force is most certainly inspired by the Nordic Drakkar ships from the real-world Viking Age. So what else in Nordic society does Shanks pull from? One thing the Vikings were very famous for is falconry, the act of training birds of prey such as falcons, hawks, and ravens to hunt hunt small animals. Ravens don't listen to humans very well, but hawks and falcons do, making them the most common to train. The Vikings were largely responsible for the popularization and spread of this practice in Europe. It was core to their culture. They believed a giant divine eagle was perched atop the world tree, and their chief god, Odin, was said to have ravens as pets. Training birds were a very real part of Viking society, and one of the most prized and expensive possessions one could own back then was a hunting falcon. Now this is where it gets a bit crazy. Falconers usually use their non-dominant arm to hold their birds. Their main hand needs to be reserved for the important stuff like their weapon or their horse's reins, so their hawks would typically perch on the offhand. Well, Shanks was originally a lefty and had to switch to using his right when he lost his arm. See where this is going? If Shanks is left-handed, then his right arm would be his falconry arm, meaning the right arm is the arm on which his bird sits. And so we have Mihawk, Shanks's right-hand man. Eventually leaves the crew and begins a rivalry and all that. And Mihawk
I see what you did there. I see what you did there.
presumably wanted to best Shanks in a test of swordsmanship, but then, Shanks sacrifices his left arm, his sword arm, for Luffy's sake. Now that he only has one arm and the rivalry has ended, his falconry arm has become his sword arm, and coincidentally, Mihawk uses this arm as his reason for ending their rivalry. While we're on swords, let's talk about Shanks' sword. A character's sword can speak a lot to their nature. In receiving Enma, Zoro has come to embody the King of Hell. Roger's sword was named after his own son. Mihawk's sword is just called Knight, which is very fitting for his aesthetic. Friggin' edgelord. And then there's Shanks' sword, Griffin. A griffin is a mythical creature said to be half eagle and half lion. So once again, bird of prey symbolism showing up in his sword's inspiration. But what about the lion half? What kind of reach do I have to make for that one? In Beaver card number 17, Oda said that Shanks' animal resemblance is a lion. Luffy, Shanks' successor, rides around in a ship with a giant lion on the front of it. So if he represents the lion, then maybe Shanks and Mihawk make up the two halves of the metaphorical griffin. A bit of a reach, but you never know. Another supporting detail.
It works though. It may be a reach, but it definitely works. So I'm not even mad at it. Like, not just to take a minute, shout out like all the time and effort he put into this video. Like, shout out to Hidden Island. Like, this is a great video. Like, I don't agree with all the points, but like, you did what really got me on this video is your connections when they were younger, right after Roger's execution. Like, those points you made about how like they were both there, that they both saw him, and that, you know, they had to have run into each other at some point after that, was just like phenomenal. Like, I really believe that they definitely probably met each other right after that and maybe had a discussion or something, and then went on probably later on, a few years later, and then ended up like meeting back up. But
the current framework of the
that's cool.
Pirates. Luffy was inspired by this crew specifically. Out of all the crews in One Piece, if I had to guess a single one that would be the closest in resemblance to the Straw Hat Pirates, I would probably say it's the Red Hair Pirates. But when we match the two crews against each other, we'll find that there's a slight imbalance. Aside from himself, Luffy has 4 main crew members that started this adventure with him: Zoro, Sanji, Nami, and Usopp. Shanks seems to only have 3: Beckman, Lucky Roo, and Yasopp. If hypothetically the two crews were to meet and fight over the One Piece or something, what would the matchups be? The obvious choices are Luffy and Shanks, Zoro and Beckman, Usopp and Yasopp, but what's left is presumably Lucky Roo and Sanji, which is less obvious of a pairing, and Nami is left hanging in the wind. So allow me to suggest a potential set of pairings that makes a lot more sense, keeping this theory in mind. Shanks versus Luffy, Mihawk versus Zoro, Beckman versus Sanji, Roo versus Nami, and Usopp versus Yasopp. The first 2 pairings are obvious, and so is the Yasopp one, but I believe that while Beckman is currently the first mate, he stacks lower on the totem pole than Mihawk here. This makes him the number 3 in this crew battle, and pitting him against Sanji makes a ton more sense to me. Beckman is the resident cool guy of the crew. He's suave, he's a chain smoker, and believe it or not, it was revealed in volume 4 billion that Ben Beckman Beckman is in fact a playboy and a womanizer. Imagine for a second how a playboy like Beckman would react to meeting these two fucking goddesses over here. And imagine now how angry Sanji would be in response to this. That is a match made in hell, my friends. Not only that, but Ben Beckman is a gunslinger. What a coincidence that in the conceptual stages of One Piece, what looks like an early version of Sanji was also meant to be a gunslinging cowboy type character. And what an even greater coincidence that one of Beckman's most famous moments is pointing a gun at Kizaru, a man themed around the color yellow who can kick really fast, the same dude commonly thought to be Sanji's ultimate matchup in the Marines. Then there's Lucky Roo and Nami, which kind of makes sense. They're both big and round. They're both carryover designs from Romance Dawn. The Lucky moniker could play off of Nami's obsession with money. Plus, in that sense, they're both greedy but in different ways, one with food and the other with berries, which are an unfortunate name for your currency when you're trying to make this specific distinction. Speaking of berries, despite the world government giving Mihawk a higher bounty than his own captain, they didn't give him a higher bounty than Shanks. Shanks is around 4 billion. Mihawk is around 3.5. Assuming the rest of Shanks's crew isn't made up of guys with 3+ billion apiece, I can't imagine any of theirs being as high as Mihawk's. Beckman maybe hits 3 bill or something, but anything beyond there is quite high. We're talking the same number as Luffy, Kid, and Law right now. If I slotted Mihawk and the Red Hair Pirates, I'd feel pretty safe, assuming his to be the highest bounty on the crew, second only to Shanks himself. And in this case, the former first mate dynamic still holds up. Anyway, as you can see, if Mihawk were to somehow be reunited in a fight with his old crewmates, the 5v5 dynamic between Luffy's main squad and Shanks's main squad would be ideal. It would truly feel like Luffy living up to the "I'll gather a crew even better than yours" comment. Plus, this would be a perfect situation for Oda to resolve many major plot lines at once. They would all converge here. Luffy and Shanks, Zoro and Mihawk, Usopp and Yasopp would all be reuniting at the same time in the same place. The tension in the air, my friends, will be so fucking palpable, you'll be able to reach in and grab it off the page. And where will this showdown of titans occur? Where else but Elbaf, the land of giants? Pretty fair assumption, especially now. The greater question here is how? Now that the Cross Guild is established,
Alright,
Cruz, Buggy, being a fucking idiot, will almost definitely overplay. Buggy would be a lot more accurate and
let's hear the conclusion, because it's just a thank you. Yeah, so yeah, no, that was a great video. Not totally convinced, but I see where he's coming from. Enjoying it so far. Let's check out something else.